Geoffrey Hill, who passed away coming up for 10 years ago now, was sometimes named as the greatest poet writing in the English language. But as much as many deeply admired him, many were also very sceptical, seeing him as an elitist, as someone who wrote poetry that was so deliberately difficult you could only really understand it with the aid of the internet, certainly. And he's a poet that I find hard to love. It's not that you'll read his poems and be swept up with emotion as you might with the early poems of W.B. Yeats. I'm not sure if he's really even one of my favourite poets, but I always find interesting things to look up with his poems, at the very least, in the quest to understand them. Always feel I've learnt something by doing that. And the same could be said of his collected critical writings, which I've been going back and forth through, skimming some essays, reading some more in depth. And what I found is that it's very hard to know what his overall point is, usually, with any one of the essays. He sort of gestures towards things, he uses complex sentences that are hard to untangle, he quotes from a huge variety of sources, sometimes going from Yeats to Gerard Manley Hopkins to the Elizabethan Sir Philip Sidney to the British idealist philosopher F.H. Bradley. And often at the end of the essay, you're left wondering what exactly he was trying to get at. At the same time, you're also left with new avenues to pursue, new names to look into, new angles on things you hadn't perceived. And that has been very productive for me with my interest in the history of poetry in Britain. Particularly of the 17th century, a number of the essays are on figures like John Dryden, and his interest in the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes and the huge effect that had in Britain and the reactions to it have got me looking into Hobbes again, and that's been very worthwhile. So I'm not sure if I could recommend these essays to everyone unless they have these kinds of interests and want to be provoked or stirred into deepening them in some way. It's interesting to compare him to perhaps the critic that's been most influential for me, the late American Marxist theorist Frederick Jameson, who passed away last year. In some ways, they're somewhat similar, just in their sheer breadth of reference, their erudition, the sheer amount of things they've clearly read into and know well, and the sort of generative power of that for anyone reading it. The key difference, of course, would be that Geoffrey Hill, despite writing some of these essays relatively recently, makes no mention whatsoever of theory, of French theory, of the last 70 years, Jacques Derrida, Foucault, big names that almost any literary theorist now would have to tackle in some way. Geoffrey Hill seems either uninterested or oblivious to them, and yet somehow he almost sort of gestures towards their concerns by his deeply Anglo-centric, Anglo-American centric approach. So in some ways his fascination with Thomas Hobbes and the problematic of Hobbes' philosophy wherein all social relations are reduced to those of power and of gaining power over others, has some resonance with the work of Michel Foucault and his interest in the workings of power throughout society. In some ways, Geoffrey Hill is trying to find a solution to that challenge through the work of great poets. Also, the undecidability of language, the slipperiness, the indeterminability of language has some resonance with the work of Derrida. In his own way, Hill raises those problems. And despite the fact that all of this sounds like he is very much a sort of trad literary critic, he is very much concerned to locate each poet and their work in the concrete historical and social context that they were in. And this itself has some resonance with the work of a Marxist like Frederick Jameson. There's at least one essay where Hill focuses very much on the economic circumstances of John Dryden's life shaping his poetry, for example, even if it's sort of hard to see what he's trying to conclude out of all of that. And maybe you could say that in comparison with Jameson's very Hegelian approach to philosophy, Hill kind of has his own version in the form of the British idealist F.H. Bradley, the Victorian philosopher who had a huge influence on T.S. Eliot. And as the label British idealism perhaps suggests, Bradley was quite like Hegel, but in a more modest way. So whereas Hegel would want to theorize absolute spirit, a sort of overall totality, which his dialectical philosophy was aiming for, Bradley was willing to say in the preface to his work Appearance and Reality that for all he knows, quite a lot of what he says could be wrong, which is very hard to imagine Hegel saying. And Hill draws on Bradley in some way, but again, perhaps not an entirely clear way. So I got a lot out of this ultimately, and if you have these interests in poetry, you might want to look into it. You might want to look into Hill's lectures, which were recorded at the University of Oxford, which I can put a link to. And you might want to look into his poetry as well, which you will love or you will hate, or you'll be somewhere in between.